Section 1, Comprehension. Question type 4, Inference and Deduction. In this video, we will be working on comprehension questions. You will need to read the text carefully in order to identify the piece of information which will help you to answer the question. In this video, we will be focusing particularly on questions concerning the use of inference and deduction skills. In each question, you will be offered 5 potential answer options. Your answer will be the letter A to E, which you feel corresponds with the correct answer to the question. Summer garden. My garden in summer is unbelievably beautiful. Bright clusters of flowers bloom along the borders of the cobblestone path. As the eye is drawn to the far corner of the lush velvet lawn, there is a glimpse of pink petals dancing on the branches of a gnarled and twisted blossom tree. Bluebirds, robins, and yellow-tailed finches nibble busily at the wooden bird feeder hanging lazily from an ancient oak tree. A group of chipped plant pots displays an abundance of flowers, vivid poppies, delicate dahlias, and dazzling red roses. Sweet peas in glorious technicolor clamber riotously up the fence, nodding in the faint breeze. Buzzing bees steadily make their way around the garden, visiting the colourful residents to collect their golden prizes. There truly is no sight more pleasing to the soul. 1. What do you think is meant by their golden prizes? Line 7. When you're ready, pause this video and try to establish which one of the 5 answer options you should give here. The question is, what do you think is meant by their golden prizes? On line 7. When you've finished working and you think you've found the correct answer, resume the video and we can check together. The phrase we are considering here then is their golden prizes, and you can see this phrase on line 7. It's useful when you're considering a particular phrase to read the whole sentence which contains the phrase and think about the context. If we go right back to the beginning of this sentence, you can see it starts here. Buzzing bees steadily make their way around the garden, visiting the colourful residents to collect their golden prizes. First of all, consider the colourful residents. What could this mean? Previous to this sentence, we were told about all the glorious flowers. The abundance of flowers are detailed here. So it's fair to assume that these colourful residents are in fact the colourful flowers within the garden. If the bees are buzzing around the garden, visiting those colourful residents, what would they be collecting? Of course, it's not literally golden prizes that they would be collecting as they go from flower to flower. Would they collect petals, leaves, honey, pollen, blossom? Bees do not collect petals from flowers. They wouldn't collect the leaves either. Bees make honey, but they do not collect it from flowers. In fact, they collect pollen, and they use the pollen to turn into honey. They do not collect blossom, so here we should give option D as the correct answer to this question. Top tip. When answering questions which rely on the skills of inference and deduction, you will often need to make connections using clues in the text. Here, we know from experience that bees do not collect actual prizes as they visit the flowers, but this metaphor should lead you to deduce the correct answer of pollen. Carbon monoxide poisoning. Carbon monoxide, CO, is a colourless, odour-free gas which is highly toxic and can cause acute illness and even death. Most CO is formed when certain materials, including hydrocarbons, which make up almost all of our fuel, are burnt without enough air or oxygen and do not burn fully. This process is called incomplete combustion. You cannot see, smell, or hear CO, which is what makes it extremely dangerous. Symptoms. The symptoms of CO poisoning include chest tightness, shortness of breath, tiredness, nausea, confusion, headaches, and dizziness. When you inhale CO, It enters your bloodstream and mixes with the part of your red blood cells that carries oxygen around your body. When this happens, the blood is no longer able to carry oxygen, and this lack of oxygen causes the body's cells and tissues to fail and die. Protection. There are many things you can do to help prevent CO poisoning in your home. It doesn't cost a lot to buy a CO detector. They can be bought from most hardware stores. If you install a detector near your cooker, fire, wood burner or boiler, it will beep if CO is detected in the air. 2. Why would The Silent Killer be a good choice of title for this passage? Pause the video again, and when you think you found the correct answer, you can resume the video in order to check. In this question then, we're considering why The Silent Killer would be a good choice of title for this passage. As you can see, there are 5 answer options. Option A says, because CO cannot be smelled, seen or heard and can cause acute illness. B says, because CO cannot be smelled, seen or heard and kills. C says, because CO causes shortness of breath and chest tightness. D says, because the blood can't carry oxygen to the body's cells and tissue. E says, because CO is formed by incomplete combustion of certain materials. Let's consider that title once again. Here it is The Silent Killer. We know that CO2 can be deadly. Consider the text. In the very first sentence, we are told that carbon monoxide is a colourless, odour-free gas. This gas is highly toxic and can cause acute illness and even death. So carbon monoxide can kill. It's very dangerous because you cannot see, smell or hear CO. Therefore, CO is silent in the home. You would not be able to hear it. You certainly wouldn't be able to see or smell it. So The Silent Killer here is an appropriate title. This is because CO cannot be smelled, seen or heard, and it kills. So the 2 elements of the title, the silent element, which means it cannot be smelled, seen or heard, and the killer element because it kills. This makes option B the best choice of answer here. Option A is not appropriate because although it refers to acute illness, it doesn't mention the fact that CO can kill, and remember the title is The Silent Killer. C is not suitable either because here we only talk about 2 of the symptoms of CO poisoning, and again the fact that it can kill is not mentioned, nor is the fact that CO is silent. D says the blood can't carry oxygen to the body's cells and tissue. And although this is true, this is not the reason why the title The Silent Killer is good. Again, there is no mention in option D of the fact that CO cannot be smelled, seen or heard, or the fact that it can kill you. E says because CO is formed by incomplete combustion of certain materials. Again, although this fact is true, it's nothing to do with the fact that CO is considered a silent killer. Option B is therefore the best choice of answer to this question. Stress in the station. Steve, get in here now, yelled the chief superintendent from his adjacent office. Steve caught Kate's eye as she painstakingly wrote down the details a caller was giving her about a suspected car theft in the middle of the night. Yes, Chief, Steve called between gritted teeth, swiftly turning on his heels. He approached Ted's desk, strewn haphazardly with files, sticky notes, pens, family photographs, and even a half-eaten bacon sandwich. Right, Steve, don't forget to chase that lead I gave you earlier. I thought you'd have done it by now. If that idiot in the cells is released, he'll warn the whole gang, and then where will we be? Ted covered his face with his hands in exasperation. Chief, I'm on it. Steve clenched his fists behind his back. He'd barely had time to make one phone call, which had been a dead end, and already the chief was all over him. The gang were, admittedly, very violent, and they couldn't miss this opportunity to bring them in now that they had caught one of their henchmen. Yes, it deserved his full attention, but what about all the other crimes building up on his desk? With a heavy sigh, Steve sat back down and lifted the phone. He rolled his eyes at Kate and dialed. It was going to be a long day. 3. What does the passage tell you about the superintendent's personality? When you're ready, pause the video again and try to establish the correct answer to this question from one of the 5 answer options you're shown. Then when you've finished working, resume the video and we can check the answer together. In this question then, we will be looking at evidence in the text to tell us more about the superintendent's personality. To help you with this question, you can consider each one of the 5 answer options in turn. One of them will be supported by evidence, and this will be the correct answer. Option A says he is organised but impatient. If we consider the text, you can see that he is certainly not organised. As Steve approaches Ted's desk, you can see that it is strewn haphazardly with files, sticky notes, pens, family photographs, and even a half-eaten bacon sandwich. This is not the desk of an organised person. Also, option A says that he is impatient. Although there is evidence to suggest the chief is impatient, after all, Steve has barely had time to make one phone call before the chief is all over him, we cannot give option A as the right answer. Both of the elements must be correct for the answer to be given, and as you can see, although he is impatient, Ted is certainly not organised. Option B says he is forgetful and exasperated. It could be fair to say the chief is exasperated. After all, he's currently all over Steve about the lead he gave him. But there is nothing to suggest that he is forgetful. He has chased Steve about the lead, and we know that his desk is not very well organised, but this doesn't necessarily mean he is a forgetful person. Option B therefore cannot be considered. Option C says he is aggressive but patient. Although you could consider the chief quite aggressive, in that he shouts at Steve to get in his office, and then is quite forthright in how quickly he thinks he should have chased the lead, this does not necessarily mean that he is also patient. Again, remember we must be able to say that both words within the answer option are true, and find evidence to support them. We could potentially find evidence to support the fact that the chief superintendent is aggressive, but there is nothing in there to suggest that he is patient. After all, Steve is frustrated that he's barely had time to make one phone call before the chief is all over him about chasing the lead. Option C is therefore not suitable. Option D says he is disorganised and impatient. There is evidence to support both of these words. First of all, we can support the fact that the chief is disorganised through the evidence here. His desk is strewn haphazardly with files, sticky notes, pens, family photographs, and even a half-eaten bacon sandwich. This sounds very disorganised indeed. We also know that he's impatient. He's barely let Steve make one phone call before he's on his case about chasing that lead. D is therefore a very good choice of answer. E says he is weak and unpleasant. Although you may consider him unpleasant because of the way he speaks to Steve, there is nothing to suggest that he is weak. Remember, we must be able to support both of the words with evidence, and we cannot support the word weak as there is no evidence to suggest that this is the case. We should therefore give option D as the right answer to this question. There is evidence that the chief is disorganised through the description of his desk, and there is further evidence to support the fact that he is impatient through the way he treats Steve. Vive la France! France is divided into 22 regions, which are subdivided into 96 departments. The French head of state is called the President. The country has a population of just over 62 million, and the capital of France is Paris. Geography. The main mountain ranges in France are the Alps, the Pyrenees, and the Vosges. The highest peak is Mont Blanc, which is situated in the Alps at 4,808 metres. Culture and traditions. France has many traditions. Bastille Day on the 14th of July, with its fireworks and public dances, is the biggest. It is a national celebration of the day in 1789 when the prison at the Bastille was stormed and pillaged by French citizens, marking the beginning of the French Revolution. French cuisine. Food is very important in French culture, and their bread is renowned throughout the world. The French take great pride in their cuisine, and it is not all about snails and frogs' legs. Wine. France is one of the largest wine producers in the world, with between 7 and 8 billion bottles produced every year. Vineyards are a multi-million-pound business. Members of the public can visit vineyards and take part in degustation, or wine tasting sessions. 4. Why do you think the writer says, "It's not all about snails and frogs' legs"? Line 9. When you're ready, pause the video again and try to establish the correct answer to this question from one of the 5 answer options here. When you've finished working, you can resume the video to check the answer. The phrase we are considering for this question is, "It is not all about snails and frogs' legs." This phrase can be found on line 9 here. It is not all about snails and frogs' legs. We should now consider why the writer says this. Look at the answer options. Is it A, because the French don't actually like snails and frogs' legs? B, because the French don't just eat snails and frogs' legs? C, because the best food in France is bread and cheese? D, because the French take great pride in their cuisine? Or E, because French cuisine is an important part of their culture? We know that French cuisine is an important part of their culture. This is not really answering the question, though. The question is about the phrase, "It is not all about snails and frogs' legs." So why has the writer focused on these 2 particular kinds of foodstuffs? It's not because the French take great pride in their cuisine, as this is not really connected to using those 2 particular foods. The best food in France may well be the bread and the cheese, but this is not actually answering the question. Remember, we're looking to see why the writer chose this phrase in particular. Option B says, because the French don't just eat snails and frogs' legs. This makes perfect sense. The French take great pride in their cuisine. Lots of people stereotype the French in all sorts of ways, and one of the ways they stereotype is by saying they only eat snails and frogs' legs. If you ask people what food they might associate with France or the French, they might pick these 2 foods in particular. But of course we know it's not all about snails and frogs' legs. French cuisine is very wide and varied. As you can see, option A would not work in answering this question either. If the writer uses the phrase, "It's not all about snails and frogs' legs," it is not because the French don't actually like those things. In fact, they do. These are 2 national dishes, but they're not the only dishes which French people eat, and French cuisine is very wide and varied. Therefore, option B is the best choice of answer here. The writer says it is not all about snails and frogs' legs, because the French don't just eat snails and frogs' legs. Camping. Gracie and Flo had never been camping before. From the coach with heavy rucksacks, it was a 20-minute walk in torrential rain, meaning that by the time they got to the campsite, they were wet through and shivering. "I did tell you girls to wear waterproofs," chirped their senior patrol leader, Mrs. Bellows, rather smugly. Gracie rolled her eyes at Flo. There was a flurry of activity as scouts began to unload their rucksacks and erect their tents, a difficult task at the best of times, but so much harder in the incessant downpour. Gracie and Flo tried to catch up with the others, though they ended up with a couple of poles left over. Their tent looked decidedly lopsided. "Bellows won't notice," said Flo, though she sounded decidedly unconfident. She carried on banging in tent pegs. Gracie hid the poles inside the tent and started laying out their bedding. A little drip appeared on the inside of the roof. Plop! It landed on her sleeping bag. She swapped sides with Flo. Another drip appeared, this time on the other side. There was nowhere to move to. Gracie put her head in her hands. She missed her fluffy duvet, her warm bedroom, the hot water bottle her mum gave her when she was cold. "I hate camping," she shouted to Flo. 5. Why do you think Gracie rolled her eyes at Flo? Line 4. When you're ready, pause the video and try to establish which one of these 5 answer options you should give. Then when you've finished working, resume the video and we can check the answer. Here then, the question asks, why do you think Gracie rolled her eyes at Flo? You can see that this happens on line 4. Gracie rolled her eyes at Flo. Let's consider what happened in the text immediately before Gracie rolled her eyes. In the previous sentence, Mrs. Bellows, the senior patrol leader, says something to the girls. "I did tell you girls to wear waterproofs." She says this rather smugly. Then Gracie rolls her eyes at Flo. So it's probably something to do with what Mrs. Bellows said which made Gracie roll her eyes. Option A says because Mrs. Bellows' remark annoyed her. This is quite probable. Mrs. Bellows' remark about the waterproofs comes too late. The girls are already wet through and shivering. And then, to make matters worse, they get a telling off of sorts from Mrs. Bellows, and that telling off comes in a rather smug sort of way. Option B says because she had rain in her eyes. Having rain in your eyes would not make you roll your eyes. You generally roll your eyes in exasperation at someone else. Option C says because she wished she had worn her waterproof. Although this is probably true, this is not the reason why Gracie rolled her eyes. Remember, this eye rolling comes directly after the comment from Mrs. Bellows, so it's likely to be connected to that. Option D says because her rucksack was so heavy. Although we are told that the rucksacks are very heavy, this is unlikely to be anything to do with Gracie rolling her eyes, as we are told about the heavy rucksacks at the beginning of the text, and it's quite some time afterwards when Gracie rolls her eyes. Option E says because the other scouts were unloading their rucksacks. Again, this is unlikely to be the case. In actual fact, Gracie rolls her eyes before there is a flurry of activity, so it's very unlikely that the eye rolling would be as a consequence of the scouts unloading their rucksacks. Here then, we should give option A as the correct answer. Because this eye rolling comes directly after Mrs. Bellows' rather smug comment, it's very likely that the comment had annoyed Gracie, meaning that she rolls her eyes at Flo. By doing this, Gracie is sending a silent signal to Flo. They are acknowledging Mrs. Bellows' comment is very annoying without actually saying anything to each other. Top tip. It may be helpful to put yourself in the character's position in order to give you some insight into why they may react in a certain way. If you were wet through and someone told you that you should have worn waterproofs, perhaps you would feel exasperated or annoyed by this and potentially roll your eyes. Dear Diary, today has been yet another pain-filled day. A life-threatening shortage of food, limited fresh water, the stench of infection. All I think about is getting out of here. The conditions in the camp have worsened in the 3 months since I arrived. My friend Rudy, who could always be relied upon to cheer me up, has been taken to another camp where he is needed to help build a new shower block. Rumours are flying around that these shower blocks are not what they seem. I dare not commit to paper what I am thinking, but suffice to say, those who entered the shower block on this camp have not been seen since. When I ask General Kraus about them, he tells me to mind my own business and offers to give me a guided tour of the block himself. Last night, Elsa showed me her tattoo. It has become infected and is very painful. I think she will need antibiotics, which we will somehow have to smuggle into the camp. 6. What do you think the writer doesn't dare commit to paper? Line 5. Pause the video again and try to establish which one of the 5 answer options you should give as the correct answer here. When you've finished working, resume the video again and we can check. Here then we are considering what the writer doesn't dare commit to paper. You can see this on line 5. I dare not commit to paper what I am thinking. In other words, to commit to paper means to write down. As this is a diary entry, the person writing the diary entry does not dare write down what they are thinking. So, are they thinking that Rudy has been taken to another camp? That the shower blocks are not what they seem? That those who have entered the shower block are dead? That General Kraus has offered to give a guided tour of the block? Or that they will need to smuggle in antibiotics for Elsa's tattoo? Consider option A, that Rudy has been taken to another camp. In actual fact, the writer has committed this to paper. You can see my friend Rudy, who could always be relied upon to cheer me up, has been taken to another camp. So option A cannot be correct. We are trying to establish what it is the writer doesn't dare commit to paper, but actually the writer has dared commit this to paper because the writer has mentioned how Rudy has been taken to another camp. So A cannot be the correct answer. B says that the shower blocks are not what they seem. But again, this is already committed to paper because here you can see rumours are flying around that these shower blocks are not what they seem. So B cannot be correct either. C says that those who have entered the shower block are dead. C is likely to be the correct answer. After the writer says, I dare not commit to paper what I am thinking, they then go on to say, suffice to say, those who entered the shower block on this camp have not been seen since. So what the writer does not dare to commit to paper is that the people who have entered the shower block have actually been killed. They are dead. D says that General Kraus has offered to give me a guided tour of the block. Again, we're looking for something the writer doesn't dare commit to paper. But here, when I ask General Kraus about them, he tells me to mind my own business and offers to give me a guided tour of the block himself. So the writer has committed this to paper, and therefore this cannot be the right answer. Equally, option E, that they will need to smuggle in antibiotics for Elsa's tattoo, is already committed to paper as well. You can see that here in the final line. They're talking about having to smuggle in antibiotics because Elsa's tattoo is infected. The only words which are not actually committed to paper, perhaps because the writer doesn't dare commit them to paper, is that those who have entered the shower block are dead, making option C the best choice of answer here. Ice climbing. Ice climbing is an extreme sport which must be taken seriously. It is not for the faint-hearted, and climbers have to be properly trained, skilled, and equipped before embarking on a climb. The sport can be carried out on ice falls, frozen waterfalls, ice-covered cliffs, and frozen rock slabs. Equipment should consist of the following at the very least: safety harnesses, belays, carabiners, ropes, crampons, and suitable warm clothing. To ascend, ice climbers need to attach themselves to the ice in case of a fall. A lead climber places ice screws in the ice and the rope is clipped through them. This means that if a climber falls, they won't fall very far. At least 2 ice screws should be anchored in the ice at all times, because neither the screws nor the ice that holds them can be guaranteed to withstand the weight of a fall. A second person will belay for the climber, using a special device to feed the rope as they climb and to catch them if they fall. To descend, climbers can abseil using a fixed rope. This allows the climber to control their speed and rate of descent. 7. What makes ice climbing an extreme sport? Line 1. Again, when you're ready, pause the video and try to establish which one of these 5 answer options you should give. When you've finished working, resume the video to check your answer. Here then, we're told that ice climbing is an extreme sport. You can see this in line 1. Let's consider the answer options. Is ice climbing considered an extreme sport due to the fact that lots of equipment is required, the fact that climbers should be properly trained, the fact that it can only take place on ice, the fact that you might fall, or the fact that it is high risk? First of all, the fact that it requires lots of equipment is not relevant to it being an extreme sport. An extreme sport is a sport which is very dangerous in some way. Lots of sports require lots of equipment. It does not necessarily make them extreme. So option A is not correct. B says it's the fact that climbers should be properly trained. But again, lots of sports require the participants to be trained very well. It does not necessarily make the sport an extreme sport simply because the climbers or the participants need to be properly trained. C says the fact that it can only take place on ice. But this does not make the sport an extreme one. Simply saying that it can only take place on ice is not relevant to how dangerous or extreme it is. D says the fact that you might fall. Of course, the risk there is that you might fall if one of the ice screws fails, but the fact that you might fall is not the only reason that ice climbing is considered an extreme sport. E says the fact that it is high risk. This is the best choice of answer, and you should have chosen option E here. Ice climbing is extremely dangerous. There is not only the risk that you might fall, there are plenty of other risks. Consider where it happens: ice falls, frozen waterfalls, ice-covered cliffs, and frozen rock slabs. You need a lot of equipment, and of course that equipment could fail. You're carrying out the sport in dangerous locations. You are relying on other people to help you do the ice climb, and of course there could be human error. So all in all, there are plenty of risks involved in ice climbing, and these risks all combine to make it an extreme sport. The fact that it is high risk means we should choose option E here. Top tip. Often, questions which rely on the skills of inference and deduction may require you to consider the meanings of words to establish the correct answer. Extreme can mean very great, but can also mean not usual or exceptional. If you know these meanings, it may help you to answer the question. Albert Pierpoint. Albert Pierpoint was Britain's most famous executioner. He carried out the hangings of over 400 criminals, men and women, between 1932 and 1955. Around 200 of these were Nazi war criminals. As a young boy, Pierpoint was different to his classmates. When asked what he wanted to do when he left school, he answered, "I should like to be the official executioner like my dad is." Pierpoint's main job was landlord of the ironically named pub Help the Poor Struggler. He worked as a hangman on the side. Although people flocked to the pub mainly so they could be served a pint by Britain's most famous executioner, Pierpoint never discussed this side of his life. He even kept it secret from his wife for many years. Capital punishment was abolished in Britain in 1965, though Pierpoint had already retired by this time. In June 2019, a notebook and other items belonging to Pierpoint were sold at auction for £20,000. The notebook contained details of the condemned prisoners, such as their height, weight, and neck size. 8. Why do you think Pierpoint's pub was ironically named? Line 5. Again, when you're ready, pause the video and try to establish which one of these 5 answer options you should give as the answer to this question. Then when you've finished working, resume the video and we can check the answer. Here then the question asks, why do you think Pierpoint's pub was ironically named? You can see the phrase here in line 5. The landlord of the ironically named pub helped the poor struggler. Consider the meaning of the word ironically. This means using irony. Irony is expressing a meaning using language which normally signifies the opposite. This is done for humour or effect. So in other words, you would deliberately say something contrary to what one expects, and this is wryly amusing. Here then, the name of the pub which Albert Pierpoint owned was Help the Poor Struggler. This is ironic because this is the very opposite to what Albert Pierpoint did as a sideline or second job. The irony here is that Albert Pierpoint hung people. They probably struggled as they were hung, and therefore they were poor strugglers. The fact that his pub was named Help the Poor Struggler is therefore ironic, as it's exactly opposite to what he did as his second job. We can therefore say that option A is not the correct answer. It was not because Pierpoint was struggling to make money. We can also say option B is not correct. The pub was not ironically named because there were lots of homeless people in the area. There is no evidence in the text to support this. Option C is also incorrect. Because the prisoners struggled to find money for beer is not correct either. We know that Albert Pierpoint worked with prisoners and with people in his pub, but there is no suggestion of a crossover. Option D says because Pierpoint was struggling to do his job well, and again there is no evidence to support this. Instead, here we should give option E as the right answer. Pierpoint's pub was ironically named because the prisoners Pierpoint executed might struggle while being hanged. The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveller long I stood, and looked down one as far I could, to where it bent in the undergrowth, then took the other just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that the passing there had worn them really about the same, and both that morning equally lay, in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh. Somewhere ages and ages hence, 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference. 9. Why does the poet say, I shall be telling this with a sigh? Line 16. Pause the video again and try to establish which of the 5 answer options you think is the correct answer. When you've finished, resume the video and we can check the answer. Here then, the line we are concerned with is I shall be telling this with a sigh in line 16. You can see it here in the poem. Think about what this means. If you say something with a sigh, how do you usually feel when you're saying the words? Of course you wouldn't feel joyful or happy, but you might feel wistful and sad. Consider the answer options. Option A says, because he might regret not taking the first road. As you can see in the poem, here it says, oh, I kept the first for another day. So, in fact, he did not take the first road, and perhaps he might regret this. This could be a sensible answer option. We know that the author of the poem feels quite sad or wistful or regretful, as he talks about keeping the first road for another day, and then that he shall be telling this with a sigh. Option B says, because he might regret not taking the second road. But in fact, if he kept the first road for another day, it means that he must have taken the second road. We know that there are only 2 roads, and if he didn't take the first one, he must have taken the second. So option B cannot be correct. Option C says, because he will be old when he is remembering what he did. There is no suggestion that this is the case. He knows that if he looks back on his decision, he may regret it, but that could happen a week from now, and not necessarily when he's old. D says because he thinks he will be disappointed with the road he took, but there is no evidence to support this. When the author describes taking the road, he says that passing there had warned them really about the same. As this event has happened in the past, it's inappropriate to say that the reason he says with a sigh is because he thinks he will be disappointed with the road he took. He has in fact already taken that road, so he cannot be disappointed in the future as the thing happened in the past. E says because he knows he can never go back to the wood. There is no evidence to support this. There is nothing to say that the author of the poem could not go back and take either one of the two roads again. He is simply reflecting on a choice he made. Therefore, we should say option A is the best answer to this question. The poet says, I shall be telling this with a sigh, because he might regret not taking the first road. Into the dark. Nervously, Finn approached the yawning mouth of the cave. Despite his reluctance to venture inside, he knew that he must find shelter before nightfall, and the last rays of the sun were fading rapidly. A rustling sound in the trees to his right helped him make his decision. In he crept, feeling the rough, damp walls as he went. His eyes, wide and unblinking, eventually adjusted to the dark interior, and he could make out the discarded debris of someone who had been here before him. A sodden red blanket, a rusty can, a yellowed newspaper. From the farthest reaches of the cave, he heard the drip, drip, drip of water. A raging thirst consumed him, and, despite his fear of what might lie in the hidden depths beyond, he made his way hypnotically towards the sound. 10. Why were Finn's eyes wide and unblinking? Line 4. When you're ready, once again, pause the video for this final question and try to establish which of the 5 answer options is most appropriate here. Then when you've finished working, resume the video and we can check the answer together. The phrase we are concerned with here then is why Finn's eyes were wide and unblinking, and you can see it here on line 4. Consider the context of this piece of writing. Think particularly about the setting. Finn is at the yawning mouth of the cave. We know he is reluctant to venture inside, but he needs shelter before nightfall. This means the day must be coming to an end. We especially know this is true because we're told the last rays of the sun were fading rapidly. So Finn has an urgent need to find somewhere to shelter, and he's reluctant perhaps because he feels a little frightened. There is a rustling sound in the trees, and this helps him make his decision. This means that he's probably quite scared of sleeping in the open by himself and needs somewhere safe. So he creeps into the cave, bearing in mind that the cave is probably dark. He feels the rough, damp walls as he goes along. This infers that he cannot see very well. If he is feeling the rough, damp walls, he cannot see them necessarily, but is using his hands to guide him as he walks. Then we're told his eyes, wide and unblinking, eventually adjusted to the dark interior. Let's consider why those eyes of Finn were wide and unblinking. Is it because he was looking for a blanket? Well, we know that this is not the case. He's looking for shelter, and although he does indeed find a sodden red blanket, he is not exactly looking for that blanket. He's just looking for somewhere to feel safe. Option B says his eyes had adjusted to the dark, but we know at this point they had not really adjusted. It took a little while because we're told eventually they adjusted to the dark. And remember, as he goes into the cave, he has to feel the rough, damp walls to guide himself in. Option C says it was dark and he was scared. This is a very sensible answer to the question. We know the end of the day is nigh. We know that the cave is likely to be dark, especially as Finn has to feel his way along. We know he's scared, As he decides to enter the cave, it's because he hears a rustling sound in the trees to his right, and he probably feels quite vulnerable and afraid. Option D says he was searching for water. Although later on Finn hears the drip, 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 and we're told that he has a raging thirst, this is not the reason that his eyes were wide and unblinking. The thirst is a separate issue to his need for shelter and safety. E says the sun was too bright for him, but we know that the last rays of the sun were fading rapidly. This means it's the end of the day when all the heat and light from the sun is fading. So it's very unlikely that the sun was too bright for him. Remember, we know that Finn wants to find shelter before nightfall, so it's getting dark. Therefore, we can say option C is the most sensible answer to this question. Finn's eyes were wide and unblinking because it was dark and he was scared. Summary 1. Read the text carefully and consider the setting and context of the piece. Also consider any characters who are detailed. 2. Read the question and think carefully about what information you are being asked for. 3. Look for clues in the text. In inferential and deduction style questions, the answer may not be explicit. 4. Use the information in the text along with your own experience to make a judgment. 5. Choose the letter which corresponds to the most appropriate of the 5 answer choices.